Hidden behind high walls and dense tropical foliage, nestled just outside Havana's crumbling colonial facade, lies a mansion few Cubans have ever seen, and even fewer dare to speak about. It is not marked on maps. No public record confirms its full existence. Yet for decades, this vast and secretive residence served as the private domain of one of the world's most polarizing figures, Fidel Castro. It was not just a home. It was a symbol of absolute power, of isolation, and of paranoia. Every corridor, every mirror, every locked room inside this fortress has witnessed decisions that reshaped the destiny of a nation and echoed across the globe. It was here, in its silent chambers and guarded gardens, that family members vanished into silence, loyalties were tested, and shadows clung to every whispered conversation. This is the story of the dictator's mansion, a structure built to protect, to impress, and to imprison, a place where history was made and where time stood still. Subscribe and like this video to uncover the truth behind history's most secret places. The air is thick over Punto Cerro, the estate known to insiders as Fidel Castro's hidden palace. Set deep within the Havana suburb of Siboney, behind miles of restricted perimeter and surveillance systems, the mansion emerges from the jungle like a spectre. More compound than house, more prison than home, its existence was denied by the state for years, veiled beneath the myth of revolutionary modesty. But those who entered its walls knew it was a world apart from the Cuba they were told to love. Built in the 1960s as Castro's fears deepened and the Cold War reached a fever pitch, the mansion was constructed not by architects of beauty, but by strategists of survival. Reinforced concrete, secret underground bunkers, anti-aircraft positions camouflaged by palms. The windows, few and narrow. The walls, lined with soundproofing. Every surface, every line of sight, engineered for control. The mansion's exterior tells part of the story. A facade of brutalist minimalism, scarred with mildew from the salt air, bordered by manicured lawns that concealed subterranean escape tunnels, security cameras disguised as birds. The silence is almost holy here, not from peace, but from the kind of suppression only fear can create. Soldiers once stood at invisible checkpoints between each wing of the estate, their eyes never meeting those of the family members who passed by them like ghosts. Inside, the halls are dim. Yellowed bulbs flicker above heavy doors. The scent is of humidity and old tobacco, a mixture of luxury and rot. The floors are waxed to a mirror shine, yet the reflections in them are warped. Echoes move through the corridors like wandering souls. Every clock in the house ticks slightly off rhythm, giving the entire space a sense of unease, like time is trying to remember something it's been made to forget. And in the center of it all, the Great Room. A chamber that once hosted secret Soviet envoys, revolutionary war councils, and family dinners poisoned by political tension. Long, dark wood tables with chairs spaced evenly, like a war room in disguise. Walls hung with oil paintings, but not of heroes, of landscapes. Always landscapes. Never faces, never eyes. In this house, Fidel Castro was not merely a man. He was an institution, a myth embodied in brick and shadow. The family did not live with him. They existed around him. His wife, Dalia Soto del Valle, rarely left her private wing. The children, scattered through the estate like afterthoughts, raised under surveillance, homeschooled by the revolution. Some servants whispered that Fidel used to wander the halls late at night alone, speaking aloud to portraits long removed. Others say his private office had no door handle on the outside. Only he could open it, and once inside, no one could follow. This was not a place for love, nor joy. It was a bunker of control, a palace of paranoia, A citadel built not to be lived in, but to survive in, the mansion remembers. Beyond the threshold of the grand corridor, the mansion at Punto Cerro deepens into something colder, something more psychological than architectural. With each step deeper into the compound, the weight of silence grows heavier. Even the sound of footsteps seems muffled, as if the air itself refuses to carry the noise. The hallways narrow, not physically but perceptually. Closing in, the deeper one goes into Fidel Castro's private domain. To outsiders, Fidel's Cuba was a nation built on collectivism, discipline, and revolutionary austerity. But within these walls, that narrative fractured. The interior of the mansion was a contradiction layered in cement and velvet. Imported Persian rugs from pre-revolution Iran stretched across marble floors. Chandeliers looted from Batista-era estates glimmered above. Shelves in hidden libraries held rare books in French and German, collected quietly, while public libraries across the island withered from censorship. But despite its luxury, the house never breathed. It did not welcome. The ceilings were high, yet oppressive, as though built not to impress, but to contain. Curtains remained drawn, not to block sunlight. There was little of it that entered, but to prevent anyone from seeing in or out. In one wing, accessible only by fingerprint and known to few beyond the inner circle, was the children's gallery. It was never referred to as a playroom. There were no toys strewn about, no posters on the walls. The space was immaculate, sterile, lined with cold, symmetrical furniture and a single ceiling-mounted surveillance camera that never stopped blinking. The children of Fidel, born into legacy but imprisoned by lineage, were not raised with games. They were raised with expectation. They were watched, always watched. Celia, one of Fidel's daughters, would later recount how even her dreams felt monitored. Her bedroom window looked out onto a garden she was never allowed to walk through. Guards lined the perimeter in rotating shifts, but rarely spoke. The silence in the mansion wasn't empty. It was deliberate. It was the silence of a place designed to suppress rebellion before it could form. At night, the mansion changed. Guards rotated more frequently. Dogs patrolled the outer limits. The sounds of the forest beyond were drowned by electric humming from the perimeter fence. Inside, Fidel's footsteps would echo through the stone staircases. Always late. Always alone. He would enter the underground corridor beneath the mansion, a narrow, sealed-off pathway that led to what servants called La Sala Sombra, the shadow room. No records exist of what was inside. Only that Fidel would descend and remain for hours. No one dared follow. Some claimed it was a command bunker. Others believed it was a sanctuary of solitude, filled with monitors and transmissions. One former bodyguard, who defected in the early 1990s, recalled the sound of classical music drifting upward from the sealed entrance. Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, melancholic, tense. In this room, decisions were made, invasions, imprisonments, executions, yet no signature graced any document that emerged. Orders from Punto Cerro came not in writing, but as whispers passed through couriers. Every decision that left that mansion carried with it the weight of silence, and the fear that asking questions would be fatal. Meanwhile, the family drifted through the halls like relics, present but absent. Fidel's brother Raúl would arrive occasionally, escorted by his own guards. Their conversations were always brief, private, and conducted behind triple-locked doors. Not even blood was immune to suspicion here. The kitchen, once staffed by chefs trained in Europe, served meals with military precision. No dish was ever repeated within the same month. Every ingredient was vetted. Every plate tasted in advance. The fear of poisoning was not paranoid. It was procedural. Servants were rotated every 6 months. None remained long enough to learn the rhythm of the household. None were allowed to speak of what they saw. Those who did disappeared. And so the mansion stood, suspended in a state of stillness, not a home, but a psychological maze. Every painting, every corridor, every flicker of light choreographed to serve the mind of one man and imprison the will of everyone else. The mansion endured, because Fidel needed it to. But what it endured within, no walls could ever contain. The rain in Havana rarely reaches Punto Cero the way it reaches the rest of the city. Surrounded by dense vegetation and fortified earthworks, the compound breathes its own microclimate. Storms move overhead like distant artillery, thunder reverberating through the reinforced ceilings, lightning casting brief, fractured shadows across walls that remember too much. In this isolation, Fidel Castro's mansion was more than a residence. It became a theater of shadows. Beneath its floors and behind its walls, surveillance rooms flickered with grainy black and white footage. Live feeds from bedrooms, offices, courtyards, even the private chapel Fidel ordered constructed but never used. The watchers themselves were watched. Nothing in this house was ever unseen, yet no one ever felt seen. It was in the early 1970s that the atmosphere inside the mansion began to shift. The political world outside was in flux. Revolutions flared and collapsed across Latin America, while inside Cuba the pressures of scarcity and international embargo pressed harder. But within the estate, the pressure was psychological. Family members began to drift into silence. Fidel's eldest son, Fidelito, a nuclear physicist by training, began withdrawing into long silences during meals. He had been educated abroad, and upon returning, found the walls of the mansion unbearable. His father, once a towering figure of ideology, had become a presence that filled every room without speaking. The strain of expectations pressed on him like the humid air within those walls. Servants noted that Fidelito's light was often on until dawn, even when the house slept. He wandered the halls as his father once did, but not with purpose, with sorrow. There were disappearances. A cousin, once a regular visitor, stopped coming without explanation. A bodyguard who had worked the night shift vanished, his quarters sealed and reassigned within hours. No official word ever came. The house moved on as if they'd never existed. Inside the mansion, absence became its own form of presence. Rooms were left untouched, furniture unmoved, the scent of a missing occupant lingering in the cushions, as though their spirits still walked those halls unseen. Whispers emerged about one particular hallway located in the eastern wing, behind what appeared to be an ordinary linen closet. Those who found the hidden door, a pressure-sensitive panel that opened to a long, narrow corridor, told stories of a sequence of 5 rooms, all empty, all locked from the inside. No handles, no lights, just shadows and the sound of slow, steady dripping water echoing from somewhere deep below. No one knew their purpose. The guards refused to speak of them. The rumor was they had been used as holding chambers, not for enemies of the state, but for those who had betrayed the trust within the family. Punishment not through exile or death, but confinement, silence, erasure. This was not confirmed. It was never denied. One evening, a storm knocked out external power to the estate for 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, 2 guards on the north perimeter abandoned their posts and fled into the jungle. They were never caught. Their names were removed from records, their families relocated. That same week, Fidel began sleeping in a different room, not his master suite, but a smaller windowless cell in the basement level, originally designed as a panic shelter. From that night forward, it became his primary bedroom. He never explained why. Perhaps he trusted the concrete more than the people. The sound inside that basement room was unnerving, a faint hum like breathing machinery. A flickering blue light from a single emergency bulb, no paintings, no family portraits, just a map of Cuba pinned to the far wall, riddled with red dots, strategically placed updated frequently. It was said he would sit for hours in silence, staring at it, alone. Upstairs, the rest of the mansion dimmed, less laughter, less movement. Curtains remained closed even during the day. Fidel's younger children, though well guarded, were rarely seen. Their footsteps softened by thick carpets, their voices hushed by fear of echo. Even the dogs grew quieter. What was once a mansion of command was becoming a mausoleum of memory. Not the memory of past glories, but of control maintained through fear and loyalty enforced through silence. The walls held stories that no one was allowed to tell, and those who tried found the mansion had ways of making them forget. The years passed, but inside the mansion at Punto Cerro, time did not flow. It coagulated. The walls aged, but nothing truly changed. The same corridors remained untouched. The same sequence of silent guards rotated with precision. It was as though the mansion had severed itself from the outside world, choosing instead to exist in a state of permanent suspense. A place where history was not remembered. It was trapped. In the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union began its slow disintegration, the atmosphere inside the mansion grew denser, more suffocating. Outside, Cuba teetered on the edge of economic ruin, entering what would become known as the Special Period. But inside the walls of Fidel Castro's compound, the signals were different. Food supplies for the estate remained stable. Fuel was delivered discreetly by military convoys at night. The reality of the Cuban people, the hunger, the blackouts, the crumbling buildings, never touched the edges of Fidel's world. Yet the psychological toll inside the mansion deepened. Fidel's obsession with loyalty intensified. He rarely ventured outside the compound without layers of elaborate misdirection, decoy vehicles, pre-cleared zones, false itineraries. But within the mansion, where no enemy could reach him, he remained alert, anxious. Mirrors began to appear in unlikely places, not decorative mirrors, but two-way surveillance panels. They reflected nothing clearly, always slightly fogged, like glass that refused to tell the whole truth. The furniture was rearranged more frequently, under Fidel's direct supervision. Doors were locked and relocked, rooms were renamed, repurposed, then abandoned again. Even the staff were caught in this web of uncertainty. Maids were no longer told which rooms to clean, only when and for how long. Any deviation from schedule was a breach. The margins for error had disappeared. In one of the lesser-known wings of the estate, Fidel ordered the construction of what appeared to be a private greenhouse. But this was no ordinary horticultural space. It was an artificially controlled environment, air-conditioned, artificially lit, sound-sealed, a sanctuary for the cultivation of medicinal herbs, according to official documents. But those who briefly worked there spoke of other things, of rows of identical plants, none native to Cuba, of lab equipment guarded not by scientists, but by soldiers, of visitors in lab coats who never shared their names, arriving from Eastern Europe just months before the Berlin Wall fell. What was being developed there was never confirmed, but its presence added another layer of tension to the house. A sense that behind every closed door was not just a secret, but a weapon. And then there was the chapel, a contradiction in stone. Constructed at Fidel's request during the peak of his personal health crisis in the early 1990s, the private chapel was built from salvaged stone, smuggled in from a ruined colonial church in the interior. Its floor was uneven, the ceiling low. No windows, just a single iron cross above the altar and a kneeling bench worn by knees that had never touched it. Fidel never prayed there, but he demanded it be cleaned daily, lit at night, and guarded. Perhaps he wanted to keep God close, but not too close. Perhaps it was built not for faith, but for control over the one thing even he could not conquer: mortality. The chapel's air was always dry, Still, dust clung to the corners. The candle wicks were never burnt. The smell of stone and iron overtook every breath. Some believed it was a memorial, others a reminder. But to those who passed its heavy door each day, it felt like a warning. By the mid-1990s, the mansion had begun to decay, not structurally, but spiritually. The children were older, distant. Some left the compound entirely. Fidelito, now a grown man, bore the psychological weight of legacy like a shroud. His eyes, once curious, became opaque. He smiled less, his movements slow, rehearsed. One visitor noted that he no longer made eye contact when spoken to, only nodded and walked away. The walls of the mansion grew colder. Rooms were shut permanently. Servants whispered of new noises, not mechanical, but organic, like breathing through stone. Doors opening by themselves, music drifting in the distance, music that no one remembered playing. But nothing was ever investigated. Nothing was ever acknowledged. Because in this place the house was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memory. By the dawn of the new millennium, the mansion at Punto Cerro had transformed into something no longer fully architectural, no longer entirely human. It had become a psychological monument, not to triumph, but to isolation. Every breath within its confines felt borrowed, every sound a remnant of something never fully confessed. The walls no longer just held weight, they imposed it. It was during this time that Fidel Castro's health began to quietly decline. The world outside speculated. Inside, nothing was admitted. The household, as ever, moved in rehearsed silence. But there were signs. Extra medical personnel were rotated in under diplomatic cover. One wing of the mansion was sealed off entirely and refitted with medical infrastructure, biometric monitors, reinforced hospital beds, lead-lined walls. The staff called it El Cuarto Silencioso, the silent room. No one was allowed inside unless summoned. No one ever heard anything from within. Fidel himself became more of a shadow than a figure. He moved less, appeared less. When he did emerge, it was often at dusk, walking slowly along the internal courtyard paths, accompanied not by guards, but by silence. His eyes wandered, not alert as before, but adrift. He no longer issued orders aloud. Everything was communicated through handwritten notes, burned after being read. The family structure within the estate had collapsed into polite estrangement. Dalia, his wife, remained in her private quarters most of the time, surrounded by housekeepers who had been carefully vetted for loyalty. She rarely spoke during meals, and when she did, it was in whispers. The children no longer dined together. The table, once used for war councils and foreign emissaries, now hosted solitary meals under dim lights, with food that was untouched more often than not. One of Fidel's younger sons developed an obsession with photographing the mansion, but never in daylight, only at night, using long exposures. Dozens of images were taken, but he refused to develop them inside Cuba. Years later, after defecting, he would describe what he saw in those photos: faint silhouettes near the chapel when no one had entered, glimpses of light in sealed rooms, doors caught half open that had been bolted shut. He never showed the photographs to anyone. The mansion, too, had started to fight back. Wood warped where it should have remained straight. Mold formed in places no water could reach. Clocks stopped synchronizing. Staff reported hearing whispers through the intercoms, voices in Fidel's tone, repeating fragments of old speeches distorted by static. But the tapes were always blank. The intercoms had been deactivated months earlier. It was as if the house had begun echoing the mind of its master, fraying, folding inward, unable to release what had been buried in its walls for decades. Tensions within the estate worsened when rumors began to spread among the staff that Fidel, in his growing paranoia, had begun writing down names. Names of family members, names of generals, names of those he feared would betray the revolution after he was gone. These names, it was said, were hidden inside a locked drawer within his underground office, the same one with no exterior handle, now sealed completely after an incident no one spoke of. The incident itself was a mystery wrapped in fear. All that was known: a nurse disappeared. A doctor was dismissed without explanation, and a blood-stained cloth was burned in the furnace behind the greenhouse. The hallway to the silent room was repainted within 24 hours. From that day forward, no one looked Fidel directly in the eye. Outside the gates, Havana struggled to breathe under economic decay. But inside the mansion, the decay was of another nature: intimate, claustrophobic, psychological. It was no longer a fortress. It was a reliquary, every stone imbued with regret, every corridor lined not with history, but with the weight of what was never said. The guards were changed again, the windows sealed permanently. And in the chapel, for the first time in 30 years, one candle was lit. But no one ever saw who lit it. By 2006, the inevitable had arrived. Fidel Castro, the voice that once thundered over plazas, that once whispered orders in bunker-like chambers, fell silent. His health collapsed suddenly, and the official story reached the Cuban people in slow, calculated fragments. Yet long before the nation was informed, the mansion at Punto Cerro had already begun its descent into absolute stillness. The silent room, once alive with medical precision, was stripped bare within a day. The monitors disconnected, the walls repainted in a deeper, colder grey. What occurred within those hours remains unknown. Only a single nurse was seen leaving, pale and trembling, clutching a sealed folder that was taken from her at the gates and never seen again. No funeral occurred inside the estate, no family gathering. Only movement, hushed, rehearsed, like actors dismantling a stage before the audience arrives. Fidel did not die within the public eye. He dissolved into the walls of the mansion that had once been built to contain every part of him: his mind, his fears, his empire. Official reports claimed he lived on in seclusion for several more years, but within the estate, time itself fractured. Fidel was no longer seen. His quarters were sealed. The underground office, the nerve center of decades of domination, was welded shut. No explanation was given. No one dared ask. The family scattered. Fidelito, once the heir in science and silence, took leave of the estate permanently. His eyes, dimmed by the weight of decades spent under surveillance, betrayed no rebellion, only exhaustion. He would later suffer a tragic end, far from the house that had raised and buried him in the same breath. The mansion remained. Its walls now held only echoes. Guards patrolled without urgency. Servants drifted like wraiths through rooms no longer assigned. The greenhouse died. The chapel door remained ajar, the iron cross still intact, but now rusted, bleeding orange onto the stone. The gardens overgrew their boundaries, creeping toward the windows, clawing through cracks, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the space. The mirrors still hung, but no longer reflected movement, only absence. In 2016, the announcement came: Fidel Castro was dead. Yet inside Punto Cerro, the statement felt redundant. The man had been fading from its hallways for years. His presence had been replaced by something colder, something that lived not in words or statues, but in the pressure of air, in the way shadows moved across the ceiling at night. Shortly after his death, select areas of the mansion were sealed entirely by the government. Satellite images would later reveal structural modifications: roof panels removed, underground facilities collapsed, entrances buried beneath earth. No official record of these changes was ever published. No journalist allowed near the property. Punto Cerro was not mourned. It was erased. But the mansion itself was not demolished. It remained standing, locked behind military barriers, watched from towers, its entrances chained not just by steel, but by the dread of memory. Today it is a void on the map, unnamed, unvisited, but within its decaying walls, the air still holds weight. The air still remembers. It remembers the orders whispered behind concrete, the arguments between brothers that shook its doors, the children who wandered its halls without voices, the secrets written, sealed, burned, and the man who built it, not to live, but to endure. For in the end, the mansion did not simply reflect power, it absorbed it. It became its tomb.